15 Ways to Sink a Sub. Copyright 1982. Chapter 1 Pitball. I slammed the front door, jumped the steps, and tossed my old red kickball across the yard to Nick Rossi, who lives next door. We had 22 minutes to get to school. "I've got the mustache," I told him, clutching its long, spidery hairs in my coat pocket. "Did you bring the bow tie?" "Yeah," he said, dribbling the kickball down the sidewalk. "It's in my backpack. My notes, too. Don't panic. We'll be spectacular." I'd made the mustache out of fake hair off an old Wolfman Halloween wig. It was part of my costume for our social studies report, which would be a long way from spectacular. But if it wasn't at least good, our teacher, Mr. Starr, would torpedo us. He grades hard. We got to the corner just as the school bus stopped for the sign. From inside it, RX Shea yelled at us, waving his arms and pressing his nose pig flat against the steamy window. Marshal Esri aimed a paper airplane through his window, which was open just a slit. In Stockton, Illinois, where we live, kids whose houses are more than a mile from school get to ride free. Nick and I live 8 blocks from Central School, and instead of paying big bucks to ride, we walk, even on February days that make our ears turn blue. Nick poked at a pile of frozen snow near the curb, trying to break enough loose so he could whip a snowball at the bus. I picked up my kickball and let it fly at Marshall's window, but we were both too slow. The bus roared off in a cloud of blue-gray fumes, leaving Nick with a handful of ice crumbs and me with my kickball somewhere across the street. As we ran to rescue it, the Oldsmobile waiting in line behind the bus honked at us. "Honk, honk." We ignored it. "Honk, honk, honk." Nick leaped up like a rocket into space. Actually, he jumped up about 4 feet across a concrete square on the sidewalk. I stepped on it. "Stinkfish!" he yelled. "I caught you, Stinkfish!" The square he jumped over was one of those with the concrete maker's name stamped in it. "Laid by Jas Wiggleton, Stockton, Illinois, 1929," it read. There were lots of squares like that on the way to school, and if you step on one, you're automatically a stinkfish. "I got you! I finally got you!" Nick yelped. He picked the ball out of the bush it was stuck in and dashed down the sidewalk yelling, "Stinkfish! Stinkfish!" I know every one of those squares from my door to the door of Central School because I've walked there from kindergarten through the middle of 4th grade, and I'm very, very good at not stepping on them. I wouldn't have got that one either if it hadn't been for the stupid horn. "A honk, honk, honk," it blasted again, and I turned to snarl. "Hobie Hanson," a voice shrieked from the car. "You want a ride?" Nick galloped back, yelling, "Hobie is a stinkfish!" "Nick," the voice yelled again, "you've got to help us with this humongous box." Nick and I looked at each other, decided we hadn't heard a thing, and started off full speed toward school, still a good 7 blocks away. We had run all of 10 squares, though, when the car screeched up behind us. "Hobie and Nick, you stop now," the voice demanded. We knew who it was, of course. It was Molly Bosco. We were giving our report with her and Lisa Solomon that afternoon, not because we wanted to. We were assigned to be on the same team by Mr. Starr, who keeps saying boys and girls should learn to work together. Arg. Anyway, in 4th grade social studies, you spend a whole month on cultures of the world. Our team's culture was China. "Hobie, you left the rest of your rice candy at my house," Molly yelled. She is the world's bossiest kid, with a high squeaky voice that is soprano and then some. It was sticky candy from China, and I left it there because it tasted like perfume. "I'm not supposed to get in cars with people who offer me candy," Nick told her, tossing the ball in the air and bouncing it off his head. Molly's grandmother, Mrs. Bosco, was driving. Mrs. Bosco is very tall and very fat and deaf enough so she shouts a lot. She had given us the candy to eat while we sat through 15 boxes of slides she'd taken on her 3-week trip to China. Most of them were pretty fuzzy. A lot of them were temples. Next to her on the front seat was a cardboard box heaped with stuff she wanted to show us for a report. Stuff like brass bowls with these flower designs on them, blue and white dishes, a cricket cage with no cricket in it, some grasshoppers and praying mantises made out of straw, and a shiny basket that looked like a rooster. We hadn't moved toward the car, so she leaned toward us and honked the horn again. In the back seat with Molly, Lisa Solomon sat giggling. "We always walk," I called, edging off toward school. "You've got to help us carry this box in. It's your report, too, you know," Molly said, pinching her mouth flat. "Listen," Nick told her, "we'd really like to, no kidding, but Officer Friendly told us in second grade that we should never accept brides from Mr. or Miss Stranger Danger." Molly flung the door open and leaped out. "My grandmother," she said, "is not Miss Stranger Danger." Nick and I looked at each other and sighed. What else could we do? I shrugged my shoulders and climbed into the back seat. Mrs. Bosco had the front seat pushed as far back as it would go to give her and the precious box plenty of space, but it didn't leave us a whole lot of room for the rest of us. So when Molly piled in, and then Nick followed with his backpack and my kickball, they pressed me over practically onto Lisa's lap. I didn't mean to squash her. I didn't even want to touch her, but when I did, she squeaked, threw up her hands like I was giving her boils, and yelled, "Ooh, sick, cootie shot! Give me a cootie shot!" They're always doing that, the girls in my class, when they touch somebody they don't like. I crossed my arms and leaned back against the seat as hard as I could, and watched Molly reach in front of me with a tic-tac-toe she made by crossing two fingers from each hand. Lisa stuck her finger in the middle of the crisscross, and Molly squeezed. Lisa sighed with relief. The cootie shot cured her from getting polluted by somebody as germy as me. I poked Lisa's arm with my fist to give her as many more cooties as I could, but the cootie shot must have taken effect because she smiled at me. I did not smile back. Mrs. Bosco started talking loud. She talked all the way to school. "Have you boys had the flu yet?" she asked, not waiting for an answer. "It's on the verge of being an epidemic. While there are always more people sick in February, this is disastrous, disastrous. Why, even in China people were—" Lisa started giggling, and this time I punched her with my elbow. Nick passed me the ball across the girls, and I passed it back. "Molly, my dumpling," Mrs. Bosco said as we drove up in front of the school, "couldn't I just come in now?" "Molly dumpling," Nick whispered to me, and we both laughed. "I'm very, very anxious to hear your report," Mrs. Bosco boomed. "Perhaps I could just attend some of your other little classes." "No, grandmother," Molly shouted so her grandmother could hear. "Later, much. Come at 1:30 this afternoon. Otherwise, you'd have to sit through language arts and science and recess and music and yucky lunch in the cafeteria. Come at 1:30. That's when it is." Nick and I rolled out of the car, still laughing at Molly being anybody's dumpling. Then we realized we were early enough to get in a kickball game before the bell rang. That was one good thing about getting a ride, even like that one. "Thank you for bringing us, Mrs. Bosco," I called in one breath as Molly opened the front car door. I was about to sprint for the playground with Nick when Molly said, "Don't forget the box. It's your report, too." The dumb box. I slid it across the seat and out of the car. It wasn't all that heavy. Molly grabbed the other side, and we carried it easy while Nick hurried up the walk and threw open the door. Miss Hutter, the principal, was standing in the hall talking to two teachers. She turned and faced us like a wall. Looking over rimmed half glasses, she said, "The bell, children, has not rung and will not ring for a good 12 minutes." "But our box," Molly said desperately, letting her sides sag like the box was heavy with stacks of bricks and important clay tablets. "It's got valuable things in it for our social studies report. Please, may we at least leave it in the office until the bell rings?" Miss Hutter looked us over, took a deep impatient breath, and said, "I suppose 2 of you may come in with it, but the rest of you must go to the playground." Lisa hung around the front door. Nick fled, dribbling my ball as he ran. As soon as Molly and I had stashed the box safely in the office, I followed him fast, with Molly and Lisa not far behind. Nobody else had brought a ball, so the kids must have come flocking when Nick ran out with mine. By the time I rounded the corner, the girl who sits in front of Nick in Mr. Starr's class, Michelle, was already pitching one to Marshall with slow, small bumps. He shot it low and past a lot of kids' legs, getting almost to second base before David Trey scooped it up, whirled around, and slammed him out from about 3 feet away. I reached the outfield just as Nick came up to kick. How do you want it? Michelle asked him. Fast and smooth, he told her. Michelle threw it just like he called it. Nick ran forward and lifted the ball into the air with a really powerful kick. Pit ball! Nick yelled. He raised both arms, clenched his fists, and started to run. The ball arced high over the playground and dropped sloosh straight into the spit pit. An automatic home run. Pit balls are the ones that go into the spit pit. The spit pit is this outside stairwell on the back side of the school. It leads down to a metal basement door with a sign that says Warning, High Voltage Electric Service Station, Public Service Company of Northern Illinois. One of those locked doors you never see anybody go in. It's called the spit pit because kids who wait in line to play, or who have very good aim from practicing, or who just lean over the railing with nothing else to do, spit in it. Sometimes they spit at things, sometimes they just spit. Pit balls don't happen often, but when they do, there's usually a fight about who has to climb into the gunk. You'd think the guy who kicked it would have to get it, but that's not true. Not only do you get double points for making a pit ball, but somebody else has to bring it up. Supposedly it's the kid who's chasing it, but Molly and Lisa, who had both been following the ball's curve, changed direction as soon as they saw where it was headed. Hey, Molly, it's your ball, Nick shouted. He lopped onto the home plate, smiling like a mad jack-o'-lantern. I've got my new boots on, Molly said. Besides, it's time for the bell, Lisa told me. We'll go, like, get the box from the office. You get your ball. Kids started disappearing like there'd been an attack of killer bees. Nobody else was going for it, so I ran over to look. The pit was, like always, filled with moldy old sack lunches, paper cups, chewed bubblegum, squashed orange crush cans, and junk like that. I took a deep breath and started down the steps, holding onto the railing because it was a risky walk. Even if it was in the spit pit, I wasn't about to just leave my ball there. Old gray snow was frozen around the edges of the steps and in the corners, and in some places straight down the middle. One slide, and you were at the bottom with all the junk. The bell rang. Watch your step, Molly sang as she passed. She laughed and ran inside. Marshall and RX leaned over to watch, and I put my free hand on top of my head just in case. When I finally reached the bottom step and looked up, everybody was gone but Nick. He leaned all the way over the railing, his arms swinging loose from side to side, and smiled at me, a half-evil, plotting smile. Don't you dare, I yelled. Dare what? He asked, grinning wider. You know what, I told him, making my way over to the ball, which had landed on somebody's frozen mitten. Some kick, huh? He asked. Yeah, I mumbled, squashing a half-dead bologna sandwich with the toe of my shoe. Some kick. I lifted the ball with one finger of each hand, and without holding onto the railing, stalked back up the slippery steps. Chapter 2. Spies of the Purple Cave. Half my mustache fell off, the right half. It had been tickling the inside of my nose, and when I closed my eyes and sneezed, the right side just flew away like a cyclone had hit it, off to Oz somewhere. So there I was, hunting around the long table at the front of the class, trying to find half a black mustache. You'd think it would be easy to see on a green tile classroom floor, but it just wasn't anywhere. I was supposed to be this Chinese guy, Confucius, who was born in 551 BC. One of the library books had a picture of him in it. His head looked square, and besides the weird curvy mustache, he was wearing a long pointed beard on the tip of his chin. So was I. It was wolfman hair, too. My shiny green kimono was one of those things that Molly's grandmother had brought back from China for herself, and since she must weigh 551 pounds, I could have camped out in it. It had huge red and yellow flowers sewn on it, and Molly said it was too bright not to use. We were setting up for the report, even though Mr. Starr wasn't in the room yet. He was late getting back from lunch, which was weird because Mr. Starr is almost never late. He is big on promptness. Nick was going to talk about the crops of China for the report and demonstrate how to eat rice with chopsticks. Mrs. Bosco had given him a lesson before the slideshow. Hold the bowl high, Sonny, she kept saying. Anyway, he was sitting there eyeing his bowl full of rice when I sneezed the mustache off. After it flew, he sat there chuffing like a laugh box, watching me bird dog around on my hands and knees. He was laughing harder than he really needed to. It wasn't all that funny. Confucius looked like Confucius Barber with chop chop, he said, and slid down on the floor to watch me search. I licked the sticky space on my right lip, covered it with one hand so nobody could see, and kept hunting with the other. I don't look any weirder than you do in that dumb bow tie, I told him. He was dressed up like an MC for the Ting Tang show we had planned to do after the report. You have to give a test of some kind, so we decided to put on this TV game show and ask questions about China. Molly and Lisa were fooling around in front of the table, setting up the Chinese gong for crashing when kids got the answers right. The rest of the class was shouting, fighting, tossing other kids' books at the wastebasket, doing the kind of stuff you have to do when your teacher, who is never late, is late. Nobody paid any attention to Nick and me scrounging around on our knees looking for a mustache half. The table we'd been sitting at was covered with a huge purple cloth that was so big it piled up in heaps around the sides. In the front and back it reached almost to the floor. Molly's grandmother had said that the china things would show up much better on her purple tablecloth, so there it was. The mustache wasn't outside the cloth anywhere. Nick and I decided to see if it had slid underneath. We stuck our heads under the table and opened our eyes as wide as we could, but it's hard to find a thin black mustache in a dark tent, which is pretty much what it amounted to. Our bottoms stuck out behind the tablecloth as we felt around in the corners for something hairy. You sure it blew this far? Nick asked. Confucius sneezed like swift yellow river. He decided that was funny because there is a yellow river, and his shoulders shook with laughing, that doesn't make any noise. He laughed so hard that he had to lean back against the leg of the table. I crawled all the way under too, and the tablecloth flapped down behind me. All of a sudden it was a violet dark, and Nick's shaky laugh stopped, like it had been cut off with a sword. It was mysterious in there. We were hidden from everybody in a deep purple cave, a Chinese guy born in 551 BC and a game show host in a red bow tie. Outside we could hear Molly and Lisa talking. You know, I can't believe those guys, Molly was saying, not wanting to help with the box of stuff this morning. You'd think it wasn't important, like it wasn't practically our 6 weeks grade. Where are they? She demanded. Nick and I smiled quietly. They were just here. They better not mess up, said Lisa. They're always fooling around, and I worked really hard on this report until like 11 o'clock last night. I used the flashlight I keep between my mattress and headboard, and I memorized the names of all the major cities and major mountains and major rivers, and I'm going to be scared enough without. Nick sighed. She's going to be like a major yawn, he whispered. Let's not ever come out, I said as quiet as I could, twirling my mustache like a villain. Let's just stay here in our minor cave and spy. The class was getting noisier and noisier, even though the sound was closed off by the cloth. We could have been hiding in a hive of cat-sized bumblebees or under a waterfall of voices. Molly and Lisa were right next to us, though, and we could still hear them perfectly clear. They must have gone to the John, Molly said, while we were doing all the work. They look pretty funny walking down the hall in those clothes, but Hobie's cushy, don't you think? Lisa asked her. Like in the car this morning, I think maybe I'll marry him. Maybe when I twist the stem out of my apple at lunch this time it'll come at H. I gagged. Nick made a fist and poked me in the ribs. Lisa and Molly make up these words all the time, and they and the other girls in class use them like they're real words. Cushy means cute. Big deal. I guess you could say he's cushy, Molly told her. If you like rude dwerps, which I don't, I'm going to marry Mr. Starr. Nick and I sat under the table hugging our knees, laughing, watching the girls pace up and down. Then their gym shoes pointed right at us, and they started straightening things again on the table. Nick looked at me, and I looked at Nick. 1, 2, 3, now, he whispered, and we reached under the tablecloth at the same time to untie their shoelaces. A girl at the back of the class shrieked, You guys, here he comes! I could hear somebody setting up a fallen chair and desk, scraping against the floor as kids skidded into them from across the room, and suddenly it was dead silent. Chapter 3, The Ting Tang Show. Under the table it was as quiet as midnight, almost as dark, too. We were both breathing hard, and I was getting plenty sweaty in my green tent inside a purple tent. I knew I was scared because I could hear my heart beating. Mr. Starr doesn't exactly string you up by the eyelashes when you do something wrong, but he doesn't pat you on the back and tell you what a great kid you are either. For at least 2 minutes, we didn't hear a thing. There was this no sound that was so quiet it hurt your ears. And then we could make out Mr. Starr saying from the back of the room, "Listen, my friends," in that way he has when you know he means the listen part but not the friends. Everybody was listening. Us too. "When I am out of this room," he went on slowly, "I expect—" Then he stopped as the door flew open. It slammed against the back wall, and an enormous voice burst out. "Is this it? Is this the China Room? I hope I'm not too late. Molly said 1:30. I'm Molly's grandmother, and you must be Mr. Starr. I can tell. Molly's told me all about your dear Dimples." If I could have breathed, I would have howled about the dear Dimples. As it was, I barely managed to squeak. Still, Mrs. Bosco had saved our lives. No way Mr. Starr was going to level the whole class in front of somebody's grandmother. Molly moved her untied shoes away from the long table. "Mr. Starr," she called out, "Lisa and I have been ready for 10 whole minutes, and the boys have gone someplace." She said boys like it was warts or air pollution. There was another silence, and we knew we had to act. "Let's break out the front way," Nick said softly, "and pretend that's what we meant to do." I nodded and tried to pull the huge green kimono loose so my feet would be free. "1, 2, 3," he began, and we got on our marks like a race. "Go!" we yelled together, and stumbled out from under the tablecloth like rockets that had misfired. "It's the Ting Tang Show!" Nick shouted as he rose. He flung his arms wide and pointed at me. I blinked at the light, stuck my hands into the cuffs of my kimono, and bowed till my head touched my knees like I thought Confucius would. The class loved it. I mean, they'd barely missed getting squashed by Mr. Starr, and they really felt like cheering. They were laughing and stamping their feet and pointing at me just like Nick did. Even Mr. Starr was smiling like he just told a joke or something. I smiled too, like an inscrutable Chinese. And I swear it wasn't till Molly swooped over, grabbed my left mustache by the tip, and yanked it off that I knew what they were really laughing at. Half mustached me. "You squared," Lisa said, and I couldn't help remembering that she'd just called me Cushy. I didn't think they meant the same thing. Everybody was roaring, especially Mrs. Bosco. She is really very fat, and she looked like a clown, giving it the old ho-ho from a squat wooden chair in the back of the room. The February wind outside had blown her black hair around so it stuck out in little bat wings all over her head, and she was wearing a huge raccoon coat that heaped up on the floor like little wild creatures sitting at her feet. Her laughs rolled out, getting louder and louder. She wiped away a tear. My arms were still in the sleeves of her huge flowered kimono. I lifted them both up to cover the spots where the mustache had been. It hurt. It hurt a lot, like when the doctor pulls off adhesive tape that's been on for a couple of weeks. I took my hands out of the sleeve, locked them behind me, and shouted, "It's not funny," but that only made them laugh harder. Molly was steaming. She was even frowning at her grandmother. We were ruining her report. "Our report on China is about to begin," she yelled, and picking up the mallet with both hands, she bonged the gong so loud I bet they heard it in Shanghai. "And the Ting Tang Show isn't until the end," she said with a scowl, hitting the gong again. Rolf, sitting in the third row, right in front of her, clamped his hands over his ears. The little blue and white rice dishes clattered on the table. "Everybody get out a pencil and piece of paper because you have to take notes so you can answer questions later." Bong! Mr. Starr rubbed his head with his fingertips. Lisa began. She held up this map of China that was about the size of a piece of construction paper. On the back of it she'd written the names of all the rivers and mountains and stuff. Memorized, ha! She read them off, poking the front of the paper at the same time to point out where things were. Off and on people would stop and ask her how to spell stuff like Zexuan and Yangtiz, which she pronounced Yang Tizzy. So it went pretty slow. It was like Nick had said, a yawn. Nick's crop talk wasn't that much fun either, for that matter. But he was very good at eating the rice and did like Mrs. Bosco had taught him to, holding the bowl right up there at his chin, shoveling it in with the chopsticks. She gave him a big hand. That's the way it's done, Sonny, she called. Ooh, sick, Lisa whispered to Molly. Then it was my turn. I bowed again, since that's what you do in clothes like that. I'm supposed to be Confucius, I said, stroking my little pointy beard, all that was left of my makeup. Some of it came off in my hand, and I felt like I was a shedding Chinese wolfman. Confucius lived in China a long time ago, from 551 BC when he was born to 479 BC when he died. They called it the Chow Dynasty. He was a teacher like Mr. Starr and said lots of famous things that people wrote down. But he didn't say any of the Confucius say stuff that people are always saying, he said. I mean, he never said, for instance, he who live in glass house dress in basement. They didn't have glass houses in 551 BC. I waited, but only Nick laughed. My dad had told me that one. And Confucius never said house without toilet is uncanny. Write that down, I told the class. It's going to be on the quiz. Marshall laughed, and Michelle, who sits next to him, did too. And pretty soon almost everyone started giggling and groaning. But Mr. Starr didn't look too happy. He was slouched against the door, and the edges of his mouth were turning absolutely down. I thought, come off it, Mr. Starr. You tell worse jokes than that every day, and we laugh. But I decided to get serious. It was, as Molly said, practically our 6 weeks grade. What Confucius really did say was something like the golden rule. He said, do not do to others what you don't want them to do to you. Except, of course, he said it in Chinese. Then I read off a bunch of real Confucius says that I had copied down. I proclaimed them like I thought old Confucius would. If rulers are good, then the people they rule will be good, I said, waving one arm in the air. Good rulers are more important than laws and punishment, I yelled, waving the other arm. Now that is something Mr. Starr will like, I thought, but he was sitting on the floor so far down I could barely see his face. After telling about the old-time emperors, I started on my grand finale. Long ago the Chinese invented things, I said, like paper and gunpowder. And they invented this. I reached into my deep kimono pocket to pull out a string of 16 tiny firecrackers my dad had brought back from a trip to Tennessee. They aren't against the law in Tennessee. Firecrackers aren't. They are in Illinois. But he brought them to me anyway to set off on the 4th of July. Thunder Bomb, the label said, made in Kwantung, China. I felt around in my pocket for the long, stringy fuse so I could fling the whole batch up, and it would really knock them out. With my fingertips, I located what I was sure was the fuse, lifted it out of my pocket, and raised it high in the air like a torch, and everybody broke up again. I could have back under the tablecloth. Lisa is right, I thought. I am a squirrd. Probably even a dwarpy squirrd. Instead of flashing the firecrackers, I was waving my long, black right mustache. Yeah, it must have sneezed itself straight into the kimono pocket. RX leaned forward and poked Trevor's left elbow, and they laughed like I was some comic genius, only I hadn't meant to be funny at all. Tossing the mustache over my head to the purple tablecloth, I reached into the kimono pocket again, and this time I looked in before I pulled out. Fishing out the string of tiny firecrackers, I flipped them to the ceiling and clapped 2 times before catching them on the way down. Everybody oohed and wowed. They knew I could have gotten busted just for having them. But Mrs. Bosco, who had been sitting pretty quiet in the back of the room, boomed out, well, Sonny, you better be careful with those. When I was in China, it was during the Lunar New Year celebration, and everywhere there were dragon parades. The fireworks never stopped. Day and night, they shot them off. And while I have a teeny tiny hearing problem, those firecrackers were so loud I tossed and turned all night long from the noise. Tossed and turned. Now, you may not believe this, but she said, lowering her voice, and without thinking about it, everybody leaned forward to listen to her. When I was in Shanghai just 3 weeks ago today, I saw a young man not much older than you are, Sonny, get half his finger blown off by a string of firecrackers. I was right there when it happened. Right there. The noise was tremendous, and that finger flew straight up into the air. Straight up. There was blood spurting everywhere. She leaned back and crossed her arms over the fur coat, looking pleased because all the boys were going gross and all the girls were going ooh sick. Mr. Starr, who'd been sitting next to Mrs. Bosco, his head against the wall, got up slowly, waved his arm weakly at Molly, and said, "Look, go right ahead. Then he opened the door and rushed out. Nick and I looked at each other. Mr. Starr had never done anything like that before. "Oh my!" Mrs. Bosco wailed. "Did I say something wrong?" You could see Molly was mad Mr. Starr had left the room before her part of the report, but there wasn't much she could do about it, so she went ahead like he had said. She climbed up on a chair to be teacher tall and got that "I am in charge here now" look. Then she yelled, to be certain everybody listened. "Hobie was ancient China. I am modern China. I'm going to talk about everyday life. My grandmother," she said, pointing to the back of the room, "brought me these clothes from modern China." Mrs. Bosco beamed. "Just last month they were there, not here. It's what adults in China wear all the time. Everybody dresses pretty much alike." She had on this blue-gray jacket and pants that looked like two big pajamas. On her head she wore a cap that looked something like a baseball cap, only the top part was fatter. Pretty nearly every sentence she used started with "my grandmother," and her grandmother kept nodding and smiling and even adding little stories of her own. Usually when Mr. Starr is out of the class, we fool around as much as we can. I mean, that's when you can get away with anything. This time, though, Molly was standing up on her chair, shouting out a speech, while her grandmother sat on her chair like a fur mouse and staring at the backs of most everybody's heads. Nobody knew what to do, for sure. One thing for one thing for sure they didn't know what to do was take notes. Besides, even though it was only February, the sun was shining. David Tray wandered to the back of the room and got a drink from the sink in the corner next to the windows. He let the faucet run for a minute or two until Molly gave him a dirty look and he sat down. Marshall, whose paper airplanes had won the 4th of July contest last year for distance, took one from his desk and aimed. It swooped into the air, and then, like it had radar in the tip, glided gently to the table and stuck, point down, in the cricket cage. Aretha Elliott whistled low. It was a great shot. "In China," Mrs. Bosco boomed from the back of the class, "children are absolutely quiet in school. Absolutely. They are good. They desire an education." She was like a bullhorn. Nobody said anything. We were quiet. Absolutely. And good. But we didn't much desire an education. Not right then. Not from Molly, anyway. Molly stepped down from her chair and went on with her talk, holding up everything in sight on the purple tablecloth, all the stuff but the airplane and my mustache, which she flicked onto the floor. When she was finished, Nick took over and said, "It's test time, comrades," and he bonged the gong with a big smack. "It's time for the ting bong, tang bong show, bong bong bong." Before our ears had stopped ringing, the door opened, but it wasn't Mr. Starr like we thought it would be. It was Miss Hutter. You could tell she hadn't expected to walk into a classroom that sounded like the inside of a bell. Putting her hands on her hips, she lowered her head like a bull about to charge. She did not smile, but peered at each kid like she was trying to decide exactly what was wrong here, and whose fault it was. When her eyes reached Mrs. Bosco, she nodded briskly and then turned to us and said, "Perhaps you all realize that Mr. Starr is indisposed." Her face was grim. "He has gone home for the day." Mrs. Bosco stood up at once. The fur reached her ankles. I bet it took 100 raccoons to make the coat that size. She stepped toward the door. "Was it something I said?" she asked loudly. Miss Hutter was actually flustered. She must have thought Mrs. Bosco had been up in our room shouting at Mr. Starr. "Oh, no, no, I'm sure not. I'm certain he was already—" She looked over her glasses at Mrs. Bosco and said firmly, "He has the flu. 5 of our teachers are out with it today, and a number of children are sick. Miss O'Malley, the other 4th-grade teacher in the room next door, is absent today, too. There are just 2 4th-grade rooms, and they're across from from each other on the second floor at the west end of the school. We're 4B, they're 4A. Another room used to be a fourth grade, but since there aren't enough kids now, it's just used for without knowing why. But just then came a fat thunk against the wall, followed by a roar of laughter, and I realized that with Miss O'Malley gone, those 4A Lux had a substitute teacher. We heard a second thunk. It sounded like those guys were juggling desks and dropping a few. Nick and I looked at each other and started to laugh. That's the thing about subs. Most of them don't know the rules the regular teachers so strict about. And most of them don't know who you are, so you can really fool around. Miss Hutter's eyes narrowed. Excuse me a moment. I have something to attend to. She left the room, and almost at once the cackles across the hall stopped like she'd just gone in and pushed the off button. When she came back in, she closed the door gently behind her and said, Class, Mr. Starr wasn't sure he felt well enough to come back after lunch, but he did so because he was very eager to hear a report. He said you'd been working hard on about pottery, was it? China, Nick said. The country, not the kind that breaks when you drop it in the sink. Oh, yes, Miss Hutter said. I remember your box of supplies. She smiled at me. A very pretty kimono. I turned so red I must have looked like a plugged-in Christmas tree. We just finished, Lisa told her. It was very interesting. And we were about to have a quiz show, Miss Hutter, Molly went on, to ask the class questions. Oh, that's splendid, Miss Hutter smiled at Miss Bosco. And they both sat down on the little wooden chairs, then started talking to each other. I got out the prizes. There were 5 Hot Wheels cars and some plastic models I had made of a Ferrari, an Edsel, and a Model T. Molly set up 2 life-size cardboard pictures of a washer and dryer. She'd gotten them from the Maytag dealer in town. They were window displays of last year's models, is how she got them. When we call your name, come on up, Lisa said. You can bring your notes. It's not cheating to bring notes. Jenny Hanna couldn't remember what Confucius said about not doing to others. RX had a hard time naming 2 major rivers. Aretha knew that rice was a major food, but Trevor guessed that there were 14 billion people in China. When Rolf finally named 3 Chinese cities, Lisa stepped forward to give him the last car, tripped on her untied laces, and went crashing onto her empty desk in the front row. Everybody laughed. Miss Hutter looked up, but she couldn't tell what we were laughing at. Still, it was like she was typing our names on a computer program in her head called Troublemakers. So we got quiet quick. We're finished, Molly said very sweetly. That's all, folks, Nick yelled, and we all started back to our seats. Very nice, Miss Hutter said, as she walked to the front of the room and stood behind Mr. Starr's desk. I'll stay with you people until the bell rings, she went on. You just sit quietly at your desk. I'm sure Mr. Starr has given you ample work to do. Nobody moved to get out workbooks or ditto sheets, so she went on. Tomorrow Mr. Starr will most certainly not be here, so you will have a substitute teacher. I think I know just the young woman to call. She'll be your first substitute of the year, I believe. Mr. Starr has an excellent attendance record, she said, looking back at Mrs. Bosco. A fine teacher. Mrs. Bosco steadied herself with the bookcase next to her, rose from the little chair, and turned up the collar of her fur coat, ready to go out into the cold. Today has been inspiring, she told us all. Inspiring. Well, class, may I count on you to all behave well with your substitute teacher? Miss Hutter asked, her eyes wandering the room next door, where we could hear a rising hum. Nobody answered. Class, she said sharply, I didn't hear your reply. May I count on you to cooperate with her fully? Yes, Miss Hutter, we all answered together, like a song. Then we looked at each other and smiled. At last, we were going to have a substitute teacher. She could count on us all right.